Throughout history, there has been a recurring pattern that invariably leads to the downfall of the world's greatest empires. This pattern does not typically involve military conquest, invasions, or revolutionary uprisings, but rather revolves around a silent, yet devastating process: the collapse of the empire's currency, often triggered by economic mismanagement and rampant inflation. Remarkably, this same sequence of events has played out time and again, repeating across different periods and civilizations, each with its own unique context but following an almost identical script. Consider the mighty Roman Empire, which for over 5 centuries dominated not only Europe but also North Africa and parts of the Middle East. Despite its vast territorial expanse and formidable military, the empire ultimately fell not primarily due to external invasions, but because its currency lost all worth. Similarly, the once wealthy Spanish Empire, which amassed more gold and silver than any other in recorded history, repeatedly found itself bankrupt, leading to a slow disintegration of its imperial authority. On the other hand, the British Empire, which for 2 centuries led the world in commerce and empire building, experienced rapid decline within a mere decade after its monetary system collapsed. In essence, history reveals that there are 4 common stages that herald the inevitable collapse of these dominant powers. First, military overreach, where an empire stretches itself beyond sustainable limits, followed by reckless or unsustainable government spending. Third, deliberate or accidental debasement of the currency, through excessive money printing or inflationary policies. And finally, a loss of confidence in the monetary system, which accelerates collapse. Time and again, the ruling elites have convinced themselves that their empire is uniquely resilient and that the old rules do not apply to them, only to discover, tragically, that they were wrong each and every time. Today, in the year 2025, the United States appears to be following the same destructive pattern, step by step. Warning signs, once dismissed or ignored, are now becoming impossible to overlook. The question that looms large is whether the nation is still in its early stages of this process, at its midpoint, or nearing the end. This narrative is not merely a tale of past failures, but a timeless story of how empires, no matter how mighty, tend to crumble through the very mechanisms of their own monetary systems. To understand this phenomenon more deeply, let us examine how it played out in Rome and why similar signs are now evident in modern times. The first significant step in this process occurred during the reign of Emperor Nero, who ruled from 54 to 68 after Christ. Faced with escalating costs and a desire to fund luxurious living and military campaigns, Nero ordered the mints to reduce the silver content of the denarius from 100% to 90%. This move was motivated by a simple but lucrative motive. For every 10 coins previously containing the full amount of silver, the mint now produced 11 coins with the same amount of precious metal, thereby increasing the money supply without immediate visible costs. This marginal reduction introduced a degree of inflation, as more coins flooded the economy, but still maintained a semblance of stability. Yet, the true damage lay ahead. By the time Emperor Caracalla took the throne in 211, the silver content of the denarius had plummeted to just 50%, meaning the coin was now only half genuine silver, with the rest comprised of base metals. This drastic devaluation meant that the currency no longer reliably held its value, undermining public confidence and destabilizing the economy at its core. Such episodes of currency debasement, and the inflation that accompanies them, are not unique to ancient Rome. They serve as stark reminders that when governments print money irresponsibly, the result is invariably a loss of trust, inflationary chaos, and ultimately, societal upheaval. Each empire's downfall holds a mirror to these painful truths, demonstrating how fragile even the mightiest civilizations can become when their monetary systems lose integrity. By the year 1650, Spain was riding the crest of its golden age, a time when the nation was expanding its influence across the globe. The discovery and exploitation of the New World had transformed Spain into the most formidable empire of its era, thanks largely to the vast deposits of silver that had been unearthed and mined in the Americas. Christopher Columbus's historic voyage had opened a new chapter in world history, and soon after, Hernán Cortés had toppled the Aztec civilization, while Francisco Pizarro had subdued the mighty Inca Empire. As a result, Spain gained access to some of the richest territories ever known, and this newfound wealth began flowing into its coffers. In the year 1455, Spanish explorers unlocked a colossal deposit in the Cerro Rico mountain range, located in present-day Bolivia. This was no ordinary mine. It was the largest silver deposit ever discovered by humankind up to that point. Over the next 100 years, the region of Potosí would become a staggering producer, delivering nearly half of the world's silver output, millions upon millions of pounds of the shiny metal. Ships laden with silver journeyed across the Atlantic Ocean, their cargoes enriching Spain's treasury beyond what any had previously imagined. The silver mined from Potosí was melted down and turned into coins, among which the Spanish dollar emerged as a truly revolutionary currency. The Spanish dollar was more than just a coin. It became the first genuine global currency, trusted and accepted across continents, from Europe to Asia. Its purity was proven, and its seemingly endless supply made it remarkably reliable for trade and commerce. This influx of wealth positioned Spain at the pinnacle of power, transforming it into the richest empire the world had ever known. The vast territories under Spanish control stretched across every inhabited continent. Europe, the Americas, Africa, and Asia, so extensively that the sun never set on their dominions. However, much like the downfall of ancient Rome centuries earlier, Spain's prosperity was ultimately undermined from within. The core issue with money is that simply increasing its supply does not make a nation wealthier. Rather, it often leads to inflation and economic instability. Spain's policymakers, seeking to fund their expansive ambitions, flooded their empire with silver. Initially, this grand influx of wealth seemed like a triumph, but it soon triggered a paradox. Prices began to rise sharply. What had cost a single silver coin in 1500 cost 10 coins a century later, in 1600. The value of the silver itself had not diminished. Its purity remained intact. Yet the sheer abundance of silver caused the coin's purchasing power to plummet. As prices soared, the economy began to fragment. Markets became unstable, and the very fabric of Spain's economic system started to unravel. The implications were profound. Merchants, farmers, and traders couldn't rely on the monetary system anymore. Farmers refused to sell food for silver coins, demanding barter instead. Soldiers, too, became reluctant to continue fighting unless they were paid in gold or tangible goods. The authorities, unable to collect taxes amid the chaos, watched their empire's treasury dwindle and its influence weaken. In the end, the internal contradictions of their monetary system and reckless monetary expansion brought about Spain's decline. The empire's overwhelming wealth turned into inflation and economic disintegration. This pattern, initial expansion, overextension, unsustainable expenditure, affliction by inflation, and ultimately collapse, repeated itself time and again throughout history. Spain's downfall echoed the ancient Roman pattern, where currency debasement and economic mismanagement precipitated the empire's final decline. Fast forward by 12 centuries, to the year 1500, and we find another empire on its rise, Spain once again, but this time during its most prosperous period, on the cusp of what would become its golden age. With explorers like Columbus and conquistadors like Cortés and Pizarro, Spain had established a vast empire, controlling territories and riches on every inhabited continent. The wealth from the New World, especially the massive silver deposits, especially in Potosí, had transformed Spain into one of the wealthiest powers on Earth. In the year 1545, Spanish explorers unveiled the massive Cerro Rico mountain in what is now Bolivia, a deposit so gigantic it would forever change global economics. The region's mines supplied nearly half of the world's silver over the next century, flooding European markets with an unprecedented volume of the metal. Ships weighed down by cargoes of silver crossed the oceans, filling Spain's coffers to overflowing with wealth so immense it defied imagination. The silver was melted into coins, including the legendary Spanish dollar, known to be pure and reliable, trusted worldwide and used far beyond the borders of Spain. It became the first true global currency, circulated from the markets of Europe to those of Asia, facilitating international trade and commerce on an unprecedented scale. Spain's empire was at its zenith, powerful, expansive, and immensely wealthy. Their territories were so extensive that the sun literally never set on their holdings, symbolizing the unparalleled reach of Spanish dominance across the world. Yet, just like the mighty Roman Empire centuries earlier, Spain's astonishing growth was inherently unstable. There is a fundamental paradox in how money functions. Increasing the money supply does not necessarily lead to increased wealth if everyone has more of the same. Instead, it often results in inflation, diminishing the real value of each unit of currency. When Spain flooded Europe with silver, it did not make people wealthier. It simply increased the quantity of money in circulation. As a result, prices in European markets soared. During the 16th century, a silver coin that was worth a certain amount in 1500 was worth 10 times that in 1600. That is to say, what once cost one silver coin now required 10 to purchase the same goods. The value of the silver itself remained unchanged. Its purity was intact, but the economy was saturated with excess silver, causing prices to inflate dramatically. In summary, both the Roman and Spanish empires provide clear examples of how the overexpansion of monetary supply, combined with reckless spending and lack of sustainable management, inevitably leads to inflation, economic decay, and the eventual collapse of great civilizations. Their stories stand as enduring lessons, echoed repeatedly throughout history, illustrating the dangerous consequences of undervaluing sound financial principles and overestimating the power of wealth accumulated through the debasement of currency. Inflation is a phenomenon that occurs when the purchasing power of a currency steadily diminishes due to an excess of money supply, and in the case of Spain, it reached extraordinary levels. The country was importing vast quantities of silver from the Americas, so much so that the very value of silver itself was being eroded. This influx of silver led to severe inflation, which undermined the metal's worth, making it less and less valuable in exchange for goods and services. However, the crisis did not end there. Spain's economy was characterized by a profound lack of productive activity. The nation was not investing in building new industries or fostering innovation that could sustain future growth. Instead, Spain was primarily engaged in extracting wealth from its colonies abroad, siphoning resources from the New World, and using those riches to fund a lavish lifestyle, which included constructing opulent palaces, supporting numerous wars, and importing luxury goods from other countries. Thus, the silver, instead of stimulating domestic prosperity, simply moved in and out of Spain's economy, entering as a treasure from the colonies and leaving as payments to nations like France, England, and the Netherlands. To sustain its consumption of imported goods, Spain relied heavily on silver earnings because it lacked a significant domestic manufacturing base. By the end of the 16th century, the Spanish monarchy found itself drowning in debt. King Philip II, who reigned from 1556 to 1598, inherited an enormous financial burden from his father, Emperor Charles V, an overwhelming debt amounting to roughly 36 million ducats. Faced with mounting debts, rather than implementing austerity measures or attempts to balance the budget, Philip II chose to borrow even more money to finance ongoing wars and his ambitious projects. His armies fought against the Ottoman Empire on the Eastern Front, waged wars of rebellion against Protestant insurgents in the Netherlands, and clashed with England on the Atlantic. As the debts piled higher and became increasingly unmanageable, Spain's king made a pivotal decision. In 1557, he declared bankruptcy, suspending all debt payments. This event marked the first sovereign default in recorded modern history, a stark warning of fiscal collapse. Yet, this was merely the beginning of a troubling pattern. Spain defaulted not once, but multiple times, in 1560, 1575, and 1596. Over a span of less than 40 years, Spain faced no fewer than 4 defaults, each one shattering trust among lenders and investors alike. Despite controlling half of the world's silver production during this period, Spain proved incapable of meeting its financial obligations, simply because it lacked the economic discipline or productive capacity to generate wealth sufficient to cover its debts. Each default further eroded the confidence of creditors, causing interest rates on Spanish bonds to skyrocket and making borrowing increasingly expensive. To cope with the financial crisis, Spanish authorities resorted to debasing their currency. They started minting coins with less silver content and introduced copper coins supposedly equivalent in value to silver, a confidence trick that nobody believed. As the trustworthiness of the currency deteriorated, the credibility of Spain's monetary system was irreparably damaged. By the early 17th century, Spain's decline had become seemingly irreversible. Its military forces faced severe shortages of funds, hindering their ability to defend the empire or expand its reach. Meanwhile, the colonies in the Americas and elsewhere began to seek independence, driven by economic dissatisfaction and local aspirations. The culmination of these struggles arrived in 1548, when the 30 Years' War concluded with the signing of the Peace of Westphalia. This treaty marked the beginning of the end for Spain's imperial dominance. Over the course of the next century, the once mighty Spanish Empire gradually unraveled, and by the year of 2000, the empire as a unified entity was essentially defunct. The nation that had once amassed the bulk of the world's wealth, turning its resources into a global powerhouse, had spent and borrowed itself into insignificance. This recurring pattern underscored a fundamental lesson. An influx of wealth alone, no matter how vast, cannot save an empire plagued by poor financial management, irresponsible overspending, and repeated defaults. Even endless resources cannot compensate for fiscal neglect. Spain's story demonstrated that without prudent control over debts, stable monetary policies, and sustainable governance, an empire's prosperity is both fragile and transient. Now, shifting our focus to Britain, we find a different story, one of resilience, sustained power, and expansive influence. The British Empire outlasted many others, extending farther and controlling more wealth than both Rome and Spain combined. At its zenith, in the year of 1922, the British Empire governed a colossal population of approximately 458 million people, which constituted roughly a quarter of the entire human population at that time. It also encompassed about a quarter of the Earth's land surface. This vast empire was so extensive that the sun was said to never set on it, not because of the worldwide spread across different time zones, but because its territory stretched so broadly that it was always daytime somewhere under British rule. And central to this empire's enduring dominance was the British pound sterling, a currency that served as the backbone of global finance for more than 2 centuries. Throughout that period, the pound sterling was the official reserve currency of choice, and over 60% of international trade transactions worldwide were conducted and invoiced in pounds. The strength of the pound was underpinned by the gold standard, an anchoring system that allowed £1 to be exchanged for a fixed, predetermined amount of gold. This link to gold established trust among nations, provided stability to the currency, and reinforced Britain's economic and diplomatic influence. It was a system built on the assumption that gold had intrinsic value and that the currency backing it was reliable. However, all empires and great economies depend fundamentally on credit, and credit inherently involves borrowing, which must eventually be repaid. Without disciplined repayment, the entire edifice of confidence and power begins to crumble, reminding us that even the mightiest empires are ultimately subject to the laws of fiscal responsibility. Throughout its history, Britain relied heavily on borrowing to sustain its vast empire, financing its ambitions and infrastructure through the issuance of government bonds and accumulating debt. These financial maneuvers were often fueled by wars, colonization efforts, the development of extensive infrastructure projects, and the administration of its far-reaching territories. As long as the British pound maintained its stability and value, this system functioned relatively smoothly, allowing Britain to fund its global influence without too many issues. However, the fundamental reliance on the value of the currency created vulnerabilities that would soon become apparent. The turning point came with the outbreak of the First World War. At the dawn of year 2014, Britain's national debt was approximately $650 million, a significant sum, but manageable within the context of peacetime economies. Yet, by the end of the 4-year conflict in 1919, the debt had ballooned to over $7 billion, an unimaginable, tenfold increase in a mere 5 years. This surge in debt reflected Britain's extensive borrowing from multiple sources, from its own citizens eager to support the war effort, from the incoming financial power of the United States and from any lender willing to extend credit. The war's demands necessitated borrowing on an unprecedented scale, but it also forced Britain to abandon the gold standard, which had been the backbone of its financial stability. In 1914, as hostilities unfolded, the British government suspended the convertibility of the pound into gold. This suspension meant that the government began printing money freely to finance the war, effectively abandoning the gold backing that had previously underpinned the currency. The pound then transformed into a fiat currency, its value no longer derived from a physical reserve of gold, but reliant solely on the government's promise to honor its value. After the war ended, Britain attempted to restore the gold standard, a move driven by the desire to re-establish financial stability and confidence. During this period, the once prestigious British pound, which had once served as the foundation of the global reserve currency system, now came to symbolize decline, stagnation, and loss of prestige on the world stage. Britain's monetary struggles persisted as it attempted to revive the pound's strength. In 1947, the country briefly endeavored to make its currency convertible once more, allowing it to be exchanged freely for gold and foreign currencies. However, this bold experiment lasted merely 6 weeks, as a rush to convert holdings led to a crisis that forced the government to reimpose strict currency controls. Later, in 1949, Britain devalued the pound by about 30%, further eroding savings and diminishing confidence both at home and abroad. The cycle of devaluation continued, with another significant decline in the pound's value in the year 1967. Each devaluation dealt a blow to the nation's financial stability. Savings were wiped out, public confidence was crushed, and the international perception of Britain as a leading economic power diminished. Alongside these monetary struggles, the British Empire continued to unravel. Colonial independence movements gained momentum. India finally gained its independence in 1947, marking the end of Britain's imperial dominance in that region. In 1956, Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal, a decisive assertion of sovereignty that resulted in Britain's humiliating military failure and ultimate retreat. Over time, Britain's ability to maintain control over its colonies diminished not because external forces conquered them, but because Britain simply lacked the financial resources to sustain its vast holdings. The empire, once a symbol of Britain's global might, was steadily disintegrating. By the 1970s, Britain was on the verge of becoming a fractured economy, vulnerable and struggling. Inflation was relentless, reaching an alarming 25%. The government found itself at a loss, forced to turn to the International Monetary Fund once more for financial assistance to keep its economy afloat. The British pound, which had once been the cornerstone of the international monetary system and a testament to Britain's global influence, had now become merely a symbol of decline and fading power, a reflection of a nation grappling to preserve its identity amidst the erosion of its economic and political stature. Once upon a time, an empire that held sway over a staggering quarter of the entire human population and landmass managed to lose it all within a mere 30 years. This dramatic downfall did not unfold due to a direct military confrontation or battlefield defeat, as one might initially assume. Instead, the empire's decline was driven by a series of economic failures, specifically, the collapse of its currency coupled with mounting national debt. This pattern of decline echoes ancient history: war debts piling up, the debasement of currency, the erosion of reserve currency status, followed by devaluation and inflation, ultimately leading to imperial collapse. History has shown us that even the mightiest empire, no matter how formidable, can crumble over a relatively short period if its monetary system degenerates. Britain is a prime example. Its vast empire evaporated within a single generation after its currency collapsed, revealing how fragile prosperity can be when the foundations, most notably the monetary system, are compromised. This historical lesson compels us to examine the present, as the current superpower, the United States, which enjoys the status of the world's primary reserve currency, exhibits warning signs strikingly similar to those that heralded the fall of Rome, Spain, and Britain. The first and most telling warning lies in the realm of currency. Since the year of 1944, the US dollar has held its place as the world's principal reserve currency. This long-standing dominance was cemented after the Second World War through the Bretton Woods system, which established the dollar as the global standard. Under this arrangement, the dollar was officially backed by gold, with a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. In practice, other nations tied their currencies directly to the dollar, trusting that it was as good as gold itself. The US dollar was seen as a 100% equivalent to gold, embodying stability and trust on a global level. However, as with every empire before it, economic overreach eventually took its toll. The United States began accumulating expenses vastly exceeding its income, driven by factors such as the costly Vietnam War, the transformative domestic programs known as the Great Society, and the establishment of military bases around the globe. By the 1960s, foreign governments, particularly France under Charles de Gaulle, began to grow increasingly uneasy. They noticed that the U.S. was hoarding more dollars than it had gold to back them, and this unsustainable situation prompted France to demand gold in exchange for their dollars. Other nations followed suit, and the once solid backing of the dollar started to crumble as gold began flowing out of Fort Knox. This mounting suspicion and declining confidence in the dollar's backing culminated after the 1970s. In 1971, President Richard Nixon took decisive action by closing the gold window, effectively ending the dollar's gold backing. The dollar transitioned into a pure fiat currency, nothing more than promissory notes backed solely by trust and the promise of the U.S. government. This shift resembled the debasement of ancient Roman coinage, such as the denarius, which had gradually lost its precious metal content, or the British pound after 1931, which became worthless beyond governmental trust. Initially, this transition seemed manageable. The establishment of the petrodollar system in the 1970s was designed to sustain demand for the greenback by pricing global oil transactions in dollars. This artificially maintained demand provided a buffer for U.S. currency. Yet, the underlying issues persisted unaddressed. The government's spending, and consequently the national debt, continued to balloon. From the beginning of the 1980s, the U.S. national debt stood at approximately $900 billion. By the dawn of the new millennium, it had skyrocketed to about $5,600 billion. Just 20 years later, the debt approached a staggering $27 trillion. Today, in the year of 2025, it exceeds $36 trillion, an increase of around 40 times in less than half a century, and the rate of growth shows no signs of slowing down. But debt is merely one facet of the problem. Much like ancient Rome's debasement of its currency or Spain's flooding of the world with silver, the United States has engaged in what can only be described as relentless money printing. Since the financial crisis of 2008, the Federal Reserve has created trillions of dollars from thin air, a process euphemistically called quantitative easing. It was deemed necessary to stabilize a faltering economy. During the subsequent 2 years, the Fed printed over $4 trillion, more than the total amount of money created in the entire previous century combined. Despite reassurances from policymakers that such actions would not ignite inflation, the reality proved starkly different. Inflation, which had previously been manageable, surged to a rate of 9% in 2022. And the true inflation experienced by everyday consumers, covering essential items like food, housing, healthcare, and energy, is even higher when measured by the actual prices paid at the checkout counter and in billing statements. This slow erosion of the dollar's purchasing power might seem subtle at first, but historically, the pattern is clear. Inflation accelerates as it always has in every empire that overreaches financially. This ongoing process of decline is also reflected in the diminishing role of the dollar as the world's reserve currency. At the turn of the new millennium, more than 70% of the world's reserves were kept in US dollars. Today, that share has fallen to around 58% and continues to decline. Emerging powers, particularly the BRICS nations, comprising Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, are actively working to develop alternative reserve currencies and financial arrangements that diversify and diminish reliance on the dollar. This trend of a declining reserve status echoes the historical pattern seen with Britain, Spain, and Rome, each of which lost their dominant monetary role as their economies weakened and alternatives emerged. In summary, the structural vulnerabilities of the current empire, manifested through rising debt, reckless money printing, inflation, and declining reserve currency holdings, serve as compelling warning signs. Just as history has repeatedly demonstrated through the rise and fall of ancient civilizations and more recent empires, the path of unchecked monetary expansion and financial recklessness often leads to decline, if not outright collapse. The question remains, how long can the empire endure before the inevitable reckoning arrives? Empires across history have often followed a remarkably consistent pattern of rise, expansion, and eventual decline, a cycle driven by economic, military, and political dynamics that repeat through the ages. Today, we observe signs indicating that modern global powers are undergoing similar transformations, reflecting specific stages that hint at an inevitable shift away from traditional dominance. Currently, nations are actively trading in their local currencies instead of relying solely on conventional reserve currencies, and new payment systems are emerging that bypass the old financial structures. At the same time, several key players, notably China and Russia, are engaging in aggressive accumulation of gold reserves. These actions suggest a desire to diversify away from the dependence on the US dollar. On a broader scale, central banks worldwide are gradually reducing their holdings of dollars, signaling a collective effort to diminish reliance on what was once the cornerstone of the global monetary system. This movement hints at an impending change. The world appears to be preparing for a future where the dollar's dominance may weaken significantly, just as historical precedents show that nations did before the fall of previous empire currencies, like the British pound. This pattern is unmistakable and, perhaps, more urgent than it seems. What makes the current situation especially critical is that the United States faces a challenge familiar to ancient empires: military overextension. Today, the U.S. maintains approximately 799 military bases spread across more than 70 countries around the globe. Its annual defense budget exceeds $800 billion, a staggering amount that sustains its extensive military commitments. The costs of ongoing conflicts, such as those in Iraq and Afghanistan, have surpassed $8 trillion collectively, illustrating how deeply entrenched and expensive this empire has become. Just like past empires, America's security and influence are funded through a combination of debt and the continuous printing of money, creating a fragile financial structure. Reflecting on history, we see that Rome faced a similar dilemma when its economy relied heavily on debasement and military upkeep. Likewise, Spain found itself unable to sustain its military efforts after repeated defaults on debt payments, and Britain struggled to maintain its vast imperial reach after its currency faced collapse. Currently, the United States is running out of time. The same pattern is unfolding once again, and the signs are becoming increasingly apparent. The critical point is that once this pattern is recognized, it becomes impossible to ignore or forget its implications. History reveals that every empire that faced a dramatic economic decline followed a strikingly similar sequence of stages, not just comparable, but completely identical. Understanding these stages is crucial to grasping the current trajectory. The first stage is dominance. During this phase, the empire is at the peak of its power, wielding unmatched military strength, economic influence, and a currency trusted by both domestic and international markets. Ancient Rome, for example, issued the denarius, a coin backed initially by silver, reflecting confidence and stability. Similarly, Spain relied on its silver and gold, Britain maintained the pound sterling, and the United States built its reputation around the dollar. In this stage, the empire appears invincible because its currency is backed by tangible assets or long-standing trust, giving it a seemingly unshakable foundation. The second stage is overextension. As the empire reaches its zenith, it begins expanding beyond sustainable limits. It controls vast territories, commits heavily to military campaigns, and makes numerous promises to its citizens and allies that rapidly become difficult to fulfill. Rome, at its height, stretched across 3 continents, exerting control over Europe, Africa, and Asia. Spain sought to dominate every ocean, establishing a vast colonial empire. Britain, during its imperial peak, colonized roughly a quarter of the world's lands. Likewise, Today's United States maintains military bases on every continent, with expanding commitments and responsibilities that far exceed practical limits. Overextension inflates costs, leading to financial strain and accumulating liabilities that threaten stability. The third stage is deficit spending. Once overextended, the empire finds it increasingly impossible to finance its endeavors solely through existing revenue. This process devalues the currency's purchasing power, eroding confidence and destabilizing the monetary system. The fifth stage is inflation. As more currency flows into the economy without a corresponding increase in real goods and services, prices start climbing sharply. This inflationary spiral was evident in ancient Rome, where prices reportedly increased 50-fold over a century. Spain experienced significant price inflation across its empire, and Britain saw inflation reach about 25% during the 1970s. Currently, the United States is experiencing inflation that many experts label as persistent, despite government claims that it is merely transitory. The real-world effects include rising living costs, shrinking purchasing power, and economic uncertainty. The sixth and final stage is loss of confidence, both domestically and internationally. As the currency's value diminishes and inflation erodes savings, populations and foreign governments lose trust in the empire's money. Roman soldiers, for instance, increasingly demanded payment in gold rather than debased coins. Spanish creditors refused to lend further following successive defaults. The world's monetary system shifted during the Bretton Woods era from the pound sterling to the dollar, marking a pivotal change that reflected a loss of confidence in Britain's financial stability. Similarly, as confidence in American currency wanes, both domestic and international actors may begin to seek alternatives, potentially leading to a rapid decline in the dollar's role as the world's primary reserve currency. In sum, these phases, from peak power through overextension and debt accumulation to currency devaluation and confidence loss, form a repeating pattern that history has demonstrated time and again. Recognizing these stages is vital for understanding today's economic and geopolitical transformations, as the current global landscape seems to echo the demise of past great empires, signaling that a significant shift may be approaching faster than most realize. Today, in a rapidly changing global landscape, we are witnessing a noticeable trend. Nations around the world are gradually moving away from their reliance on the United States dollar as the dominant international currency. This shift signals a potentially profound transformation that could lead us through what can be understood as the seventh and final stage, the collapse. When a country reaches this stage, its entire economic system begins to unravel, and the once powerful currency either becomes entirely worthless or loses its privileged position in the global financial hierarchy. As a consequence, the empire, whether it be economic or political, finds itself unable to fund its military endeavors or sustain its influence and control over other nations. Historically, history offers us stark examples of this process. For instance, the mighty Roman Empire, at its decline, could no longer afford the costs of defending its borders against invading Germanic tribes, ultimately falling to their invasions. Similarly, Spain, once a dominant global empire, experienced a sharp decline into insignificance, losing its vast overseas holdings and economic prominence. Britain, which had once ruled an extensive empire across continents, saw its imperial reach diminish rapidly within just a few decades, losing its colonial dominance and influence. And in our own recent history, the United States faces a fundamental question. Is it heading down a similar path right now? This sequence of decline is not unique. It repeats itself in what appears to be a hardwired pattern. Over the course of 2,000 years, this pattern has manifested across at least 4 major empire builds on different continents, with different currencies and distinct histories, yet always following the same 7-stage sequence. The underlying mechanics are rooted in mathematics and economics. It is impossible for any nation or empire to perpetually spend more than it earns. Printing money, creating prosperity out of thin air, cannot be sustained indefinitely, especially when it leads to the debasement of the currency. Such actions inevitably carry consequences, whether through inflation, loss of confidence, or systemic collapse. This pattern is unbreakable and predetermined. Currently, We find ourselves at what can be identified as stage 5, and we are hurtling swiftly toward stage 6. The question then arises, what lies ahead once we reach that critical point? Based on historical evidence, there are 3 potential paths, 3 outcomes, that could unfold. The first possibility is a managed or controlled decline. An example of this can be seen in Britain after the year 1945, when the country relinquished its empire and lost its reserve currency status. While it experienced painful devaluation, inflation, and a significant economic adjustment, Britain did not vanish entirely. Instead, it adapted to a new, diminished stature as a secondary global power. This was a slow, often humbling process, characterized by a steady reduction of influence, but it avoided total collapse or chaos. The second potential scenario is a sudden and chaotic collapse, similar to what happened to ancient Rome in the 5th century. When the currency there became worthless, government control was lost, and the empire fragmented into smaller, chaotic entities. During this dark age, an era of upheaval and societal disintegration, the entire system of political, social, and economic order could collapse in a matter of months or years, leading to an extended period of chaos and suffering. This outcome is the most destructive, a complete systemic breakdown that threatens not only economic stability, but also the very fabric of civilization. The third possibility involves a reset and restructuring of the monetary system. In such a case, after the collapse, a new currency system is rapidly established, potentially one backed once again by gold or another tangible asset. Alternatively, a new reserve currency might emerge, whether it be China's yuan, a basket of different currencies, or digital currencies. Although the old system would die, the transition could be relatively swift, allowing civilization to continue with some semblance of stability. While this scenario entails hardship and uncertainty, it remains within the realm of survivability, offering a chance for recovery and future growth. Presently, the United States finds itself at a critical crossroads. The enormous national debt, already into the tens of trillions of dollars, has reached a point where it can no longer be realistically repaid under current spending and economic conditions. The options available are stark: either default, which would instantly obliterate the dollar's global reserve status, accelerate inflation, which is already underway and likely to worsen, or attempt a restructuring of the debt and economic system, which the current political landscape does not seem prepared to undertake. What makes this situation fundamentally different from the declines experienced by ancient Rome, Spain, or Britain is the global reach of the US dollar. Unlike those regional empires whose collapses primarily impacted their own territories, the US dollar serves as the central reserve currency of the entire world. When the Roman denarius collapsed, it primarily affected the Roman Empire and its immediate surroundings. When Spain's silver influx led to inflation, it primarily impacted Spain and its colonies. But the current American role as the principal reserve currency means that any decline or sudden collapse has ripple effects across the entire interconnected global economy. Every central bank, every international trade agreement, and every financial market operates within a complex, intertwined system. This interconnectedness amplifies not only the scale of potential chaos, but also the speed at which it could unfold, transforming a national economic crisis into a global catastrophe. The pattern of decline, reinforced by history and the unforgiving laws of economics, indicates that this process is inevitable. It is not a matter of crystal ball prediction, but of understanding the precedents set by history. For major empires have undergone currency collapses, each following an almost identical sequence, driven by the immutable arithmetic of empire building. Ancient Rome debased its denarius repeatedly to fund its legions, ultimately leading to its monetary collapse and the empire's downfall. Spain flooded the world with silver from its colonies, causing inflation and erosion of wealth that contributed to its decline. Britain, burdened by the costs of fighting 2 devastating world wars, borrowed extensively to sustain its empire, which eventually led to the collapse of the pound and the end of its imperial dominance. These examples serve as stark reminders that no empire's currency can be devalued or overstretched indefinitely without ensuing consequences. In conclusion, the pattern is clear and consistent across history. No matter how long an empire tries to delay or deny its decline, the mathematics of economic and political entropy will inevitably catch up. Symbols of power, be they currencies or empires, are inherently finite, and their collapse is often triggered when the costs of sustaining them outweigh any perceived benefits. The overarching lesson from history is that the decline of great civilizations is an inevitable process, driven by the relentless laws of economics and history itself, and that the only questions remaining are when and how it will happen. Currently, the United States finds itself in a situation where it is engaging in the unprecedented practice of printing trillions upon trillions of dollars, all the while running continuous budget deficits that seem to stretch on endlessly. This approach, despite appearances, is fundamentally no different from the patterns that have repeated throughout history. The notion that America is somehow immune to these long-standing economic laws is misguided. The reality is that the patterns governing economies are universal and unyielding. It is crucial to understand that economic principles are as immutable as the physical laws that govern the natural world. No matter how powerful or technologically advanced a nation may be, it cannot conjure genuine wealth simply by printing money. Neither can it sustain unlimited borrowing without eventually facing serious repercussions. Furthermore, attempting to devalue its currency, deliberately reducing its worth, in pursuit of short-term gains will ultimately lead to catastrophic consequences, including the disintegration of the nation's economic stability and, potentially, its empire itself. Throughout history, we observe the rise and fall of imperiums, be they the Roman Empire, Spain's vast colonial dominions, or Britain's global empire, each following a remarkably similar pattern. In these cases, excessive debt, reckless money printing, and currency devaluation played pivotal roles in their downfall. Despite differences in time and culture, the underlying mechanics remained the same, culminating in collapse. The only variable in these historical narratives is the timing. How long before the inevitable occurs? How much longer can the world maintain confidence in the dollar and in America's economic strength before doubts begin to surface? Questions loom large, such as how close we truly are to a tipping point. Could it be that we are nearing the moment when the American empire, like those before it, will make its final decline and be consigned to history? The signs are mounting: rising national debt, ongoing money creation, and a general loss of confidence in the financial system. Together, these indicators point toward an imminent crisis. The historical record, which has witnessed similar patterns leading to the collapse of four great empires, suggests that such an outcome is not just possible, but inevitable. The only uncertainty remaining is how swiftly these developments will unfold and how severe their impact will be. Will the decline happen suddenly, catching many unprepared? Or will it be more gradual, allowing for some adaptation before the fall? Whatever the case, the pain inflicted by such a collapse is likely to be significant. If gaining this perspective has provided you with a new understanding of current global economic dynamics, it might be wise to consider the lessons of history. When the pattern reaches its conclusion, understanding what transpired and why it happened will be crucial for making informed decisions. History, with all its lessons, offers clarity, and because the pattern is unchanging, it reliably reveals the trajectory we are on. The long-term truth is that the sequence of events leading to economic collapse has played out 4 times before, and these cycles never lie nor change their fundamental course.